time. Going back to Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to probe your findings in the Ouimet report. You undertook an investigation into Green Slush Fund board member Guy Ouimet. You looked more specifically into allegations of conflict of interest when Mr. Ouimet voted along with the rest of the board to approve $38.5 million in taxpayer dollars in so-called COVID relief payments, $38.5 million that the Auditor General determined improperly went out the door. At issue with Mr. Ouimet is that he had a 1% interest in a company called Lithion, a company that received nearly $400,000 from the COVID relief payments that Mr. Ouimet improperly voted to approve. You found that Mr. Ouimet had a financial interest when he voted to approve this funding, correct?
Yeah.
And you found that when Mr. Ouimet participated in and voted to approve the so-called COVID relief payments, he knew that Lithion, a company that he had an interest in, would benefit, correct?
Yes, yes, yes.
And therefore, he had a private interest in those decisions, right?
Correct.
And as a result, it was your conclusion that Mr. Ouimet's conduct fell short of the Conflict of Interest Act, more specifically Sections 6 and 21, which taken together require a public office holder such as Mr. Ouimet to recuse themselves on matters in which they have a conflict of interest. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Nonetheless, you dismissed the allegations against Mr. Ouimet on the basis of the principle of de minimis, that his 1% interest in Lithion was of a trivial nature, and that's at paragraph 144 of your report. Did you ask Mr. Ouimet the dollar value of his 1% interest in Lithion?
Michael, can you answer?
Yeah, it was $1,200 interest.
That's correct. It was $1,200 at the time, but in 3 short years after Mr. Ouimet voted to funnel nearly $400,000 from the Green Slush Fund into Lithion, his 1% interest in Lithion has increased by nearly 900%. It went from $1,250 to $11,000. That's quite a return, wouldn't you say?
Well, let's start at the beginning. Mr. Ouimet, like everybody else, voted on the COVID. It was a voting, 2 votes which were taken, and at the time there was absolutely no reference to conflict of interest at all, because the advice from corporate counsel, who was at not corporate, what's it called? Reporting counsel says there was no need.
I don't want to interrupt you, but bad legal advice doesn't excuse one from following the Conflict of Interest Act.
Did I say it did?
Well, you were alluding to bad legal advice.
I'm trying to give an answer. So everybody who voted on that was in. If they had in conflict, was in conflict. Mr. Ouimet's conflict, interest was in this tiny little sliver of a company, and you know, I don't know.
Well, I just find it interesting that you looked at $1,250, but you didn't look at the fact that it increased by 900% in value after he votes to funnel $400,000 to a company that he had an interest in. He knew he had an interest in it at the time, and all of a sudden his so-called trivial 1% interest increases nearly 900%. How is a conflict of interest that is too small to matter? Because it is a fact that Mr. Ouimet, with the greatest of respect, profited handsomely in part because of his conflicts of interest at the Green Slush Fund.
He had a 1% interest. He could have lost that 1% interest, or the vote was not on his 1% interest. The vote was on a number of companies, all the companies that STDC until that point had supported, and did they need an emergency funding before COVID. He, like all the others, voted. As I've said in my report, it was totally wrong.
He voted to funnel $400,000 into a company
that
he
voted
had an
for
interest
his
in,
1%.
and he profited handsomely from that. And I would submit that that isn't a trivial matter.
Yes,
At
just
best,
one second, Mr.
at
Von
best
Pinstein.
he voted.
Mr. Von Pinstein, just one second. I do have a point of order from Mr.
Yeah,
Delaney,
just,
who's-
I'm having a hard time listening who's up, and I know it's the members' time, I respect
I
that, but obviously we need to hear from the witnesses as well.
Very good. Yes, the members can avoid speaking over themselves. So what I'm going to do before Mr. Von Finkenstein, I'm going to see, Mr. Cooper, you've got about 15 seconds left. So do you have a further follow-up? All right. Mr. Von Finkenstein, the floor is yours, and that will lead us into our next member after. You have the floor, please.
At best, you can say that he voted to save the $1,200 that he had invested. That was at stake at the time he made his vote. And I found that was so trivial it didn't work. The principle of the minimis non iura peta applied. That was at issue for him at the time he took the vote. Subsequent events, as you point out, it turned out to be positive, it could have been negative, etc. I have no idea, and that was not the issue. The issue was what was at stake for him at the point in time he took the vote, and that was $1,200.